We'll do a review of Lakutei Sichas in Chelek Yutes, the second Sicha for the Parshas Nitzavim. This is a Rashi Sicha in which the Rebbe discusses the covenant that we read in the Parsha, La'avrecha b'vris Hashem Elokecha, that there was a covenant made with the Bnei Yisrael. Atem Nitzavim hayom kulchem la'avrecha b'vris. And Moshe Rabbeinu says with those that are here and those that are in the future, the covenant was with them. And the whole discussion starts off with why is it and how does the covenant take place with the future generation. We'll see what Rashi says and how the Mefarshim explain it. And as the Rebbe asks, that it says very clearly in the Pasuk that Hashem forms a covenant with all the future generations, and Rashi just tells us these facts that it was with the future generations. Seemingly, what the pasuk says, Rashi does not explain how it takes place, and the Rebbe will bring his insight and explain to us how this all works. So let's start off with Aleph. Beim Krisis Bris Bereish Parshasenu, by the forming of the covenant in the beginning of the Parsha, Werd gesagt in Pasuk. So it is stated, it is said in the verse, V'loi itchem levatchem anoichi koires es abris hazois. It is not only with you that I formed this covenant, V'es ha'olah hazois, and this oath, Ki es asher yeshnoi poi imonu oimed hayom lifnei Hashem Elokeinu. For with the one who are here, find themselves here together with us, standing before Hashem our God, and also and also the one who is not with us here today. That's the pasuk. So Rashi places himself on the words when he's mefarish, and he explains that that also with the generation that are destined to be, that is a nenu poi. So Lemon Mefarshim, so the Mefarshim interpret as Rashi Bavoran Dermi, that Rashi is cautioning us with this, Amazonis Taichen as a nenu poi made the Eden for Yenem Doir was einen dort nicht gewähnt bei Matzav. So don't interpret that Einanu Poi, they're not here, means the Jews from that generation that are not there, weren't there at that standing. So those who are here and those are not here. So Rashi is coming to caution us that don't think that that is what's meant with Einanu Poi, that they're not here presently at the time of this gathering. Why can't we say that? Because everybody was there. And that's not, we cannot interpret it that way. Because it states earlier, Atem Nitzavim hayom kulchem. It says all are there. Koilish Yisrael, all Jewish men. So all the people of Israel were there. So who wasn't there? So we can't mean those who are not there. As alle Eden haben sich gefunden bei that all Jews found themselves at that standing. The Riber sagt Rashi, that's why Rashi says, as ve'es asher enenu poi, meant, what does it mean who is not here? The Doiros Hasidim Lius, the generations that are destined to come. Das is aber nicht maspik. This is not yet a sufficient interpretation, because while we know that it has to be the future generation, we don't need Rashi to tell us that. That would be everybody is there. That's obvious. It says who ones who are here, who ones who are not here. So who is not here? It has to be the future generation. Since the verse himself states clearly, Atem Nitzavim hayom kulchem, that you are standing, all of you, First statement, the Chalein, so that's self-understood. Oichon Pirush Rashi, even without Rashi's commentary, as a nenu poi gate of the Kumadikedoides, that a nenu poi is referring to the coming generations. And what is Rashi Mechadish mit sein Pirush? So what is Rashi coming up with the novelty with his interpretation? Doirim ha'asidim liyos. The future generation seems to be obvious. So the Rebbe is an mefarshim Moshe. So therefore the mefarshim add Lule Pirush Rashi, had it not been for Rashi, well, given schwer lernen, it would be difficult to interpret as miteinenu poi, that those who are not here, werd gemeint, what is meant, who are not here, the später dikedoides, the generations that come later on. Varum, because vi shayich lichris brisi ma'eder. How could you make a covenant with somebody who's not? If they're not here, what kind of a covenant is it with people who are not here? So we still have a problem. How does this take place? I mean, you have to learn that it means the next generation, but how does this take place? The Rebbe Dr. Rashi, Rashi says, and also with the generation that are destined to be, because the mitzvahs are mechadish. So when Rashi comes up with the idea over here, that it does apply to form a covenant with the future generation. Vila. Number one, Aleph. There's two explanations they give. How do you form? How do you actually form a covenant with those who are not here? Number one, their neshamas zanedamul given, that their souls were there. Umidzeis is given the Christus bris, and the covenant took place, was formed with the souls. And number two, the other possibilities, since the son is the foot of the father, so to speak, is a continuation. So the children are a continuation of their parents. Therefore, also the sons are included in this covenant that was formed with the fathers. It passes along because they're part of their parents, so it passes along to their children. Base. Rebbe says, this is not understood. I mean, the interpretation, how it takes place, is not something that the child learning the Chumash can figure out on his own without the Mefarshei Rashi. So how would Rashi not even hint to it? Aleph. So number one, the Rebbe is going to challenge this interpretation for several reasons. So we get at number one, we get at Kama Pamim, as spoken many times. Rashi wrote his commentary in such a manner as ben chomesh lemikra, that even somebody who's just 5 years old, as the Mishnah says, starts to learn the Chumash, soll von seine Wörter kennen verstehen, so should, from the words of Rashi, understand them pshat from pasuk, the meaning of the pasuk. Rashi did not rely that somebody's going to come and explain to him what Rashi means. Nicht darfen dich ankommen zu dem, was meforshim seine Masvir und Moshe. Not having to come on to that which the commentators explain in that. If he says kosher beniden the dan, so based on this, it's difficult in our situation. Der Ben Chomesh hat wegen dem Inyan von Brok Hare Dabua, the 5-year-old, this idea, this concept as a son is a foot of the father. He hadn't studied this in none of the previous sections of the Chumash. He also doesn't know whether the souls of the future generations, if they participate, if they were there at the covenant, or they need or not. So if this is what Rashi really means with his commentary, that it is a covenant formed with the continuous generation because of these two reasons, Rashi should have said it. Rashi is oisun to oifta. If Rashi is out to to come up with this idea as that also with the non-born yet generations, you are able to form a covenant. So he should have clearly articulated how is this possible? He should have said, whether it is because of the existence of the soul, or that is because the son is the continuation of the father. So to say that Rashi means these interpretations is not very difficult, because Rashi, if they meant that, Rashi should have explained. And if you look at the Rashi, the Rebbe says in Beis that Rashi really doesn't say at all how. Rashi just says with whom, not how, and with whom is not necessary, because we know that all those that were there. But so this makes it even more difficult to interpret, as if Rashi is coming to explain how a covenant can be formed with future people that are not here at the time. Base. The Kashi is not stark. Them Inyan as a nenupoi gate of Deris Asid and Lias. This concept that those who are not here is referring to the generation that are destined to be. First, the Talmud Alain. The student understands it on his own. Therefore, was in Posuk state freer, the fact that the Posuk states earlier, that you're all together. So everybody was there. So we know that part that we're talking about, the future generation, the student knows on his own. And as the Mepharshim explained, Rashi is mechadesh subavorane. And what Rashi comes up here to caution us, not this idea that, and then of those who are not here is referring to the further generation, nor but Rashi is just coming to explain how are you able to form a covenant according to the Mepharshim. This is what Rashi is explaining with the future, with the Doiras HaSidim, with the future generation. So if them is afil kenemes they toin zayne verter. So there's not even a hint in the words of Rashi. Rashi says va'afim Doiras HaSidim liyas. Also with those generations, it doesn't explain at all how that is possible. So kum dachois. So it turns out as iker chaser ben hasefer that the main aspect that Rashi is coming to teach us over here, which is how this is done, is lacking. It doesn't say. It only gives you the future. That part we don't need Rashi to tell us, because that's obvious. And then this whole idea that the Mepharshim explained that Rashi is coming to teach us the idea that you can form a covenant. How could you form the covenant? But this is not the first time that we're doing a covenant with old generations. We find it by Avram. The whole Torah mitzvahs are said to people at that time, and the obligation is for all generations. Gimel. Them inya for Christus bris, which better dikedoiris. This idea of forming a covenant with generations that follow is azach was megifit keinze de friedike sedrus. This is something that we find similarly in the previous sedrus in the Torah. The bris bein habsorim, the covenant that took place between the pieces with Avram Avinu in the Parshas Lech Lecha is given in Shayches to Zarei Shel Avraham. That was as it relates to the seed of Avram. The pasuk talks about what's going to happen to the seed. That is going to be many generations later. Hashem is making covenant with Avraham about things that are going to take place with many generations later on. The same thing is similar to this is also in the section of Koisai, which is the words of the covenant with the Teichacha, which Hashem is making a covenant together for all the generations to come. Und euch raufen the mitzvahs, was der Eibishter hat angesagt durch Moshe Rabbeinu, a majority of the mitzvahs that Hashem has instructed Through Moshe Rabbeinu was told by Hashem, seine mitzvahs shenitztav l'doros, there are mitzvahs that have been instructed for generations to come. So, according to this idea that there's a difficulty, how could you tell the father and to the children to then automatically it goes to the next generation? So Rashi should have explained over there. You should have asked the question over there. How is it? How does it connect that a Keris is bris with Avraham Avinu when Hashem makes a covenant, forms a covenant with Avraham Avinu, or the Nitzavim mitzvah through Moshe Rabbeinu, or when Hashem commands the mitzvahs through Moshe Rabbeinu? So Chal Zayin of the Eden for the Kumah Kedoros. How could this rest upon? How could it apply to the Jews of the future generation of Yitzvah? And Rashi never bothers and yet we see, as in the Ala Erte Bavorot, Rashi the Shaila now, that in all the places, Rashi doesn't answer, does not caution us about this question. Why would Rashi need to explain this in the Parshas Nitzavim? So this is all proving that the Mefarshim, that they want to learn, that this is trying to explain how could you form a covenant. That doesn't really sit, because we don't even need a pasuk for that. As you'll see, that the Rebbe will explain that actually Rashi's intention is something different, not as the Mefarshim explained it. Number 4, the Rebbe is going to ask the Lashon. In Gemara state, the Gemara states, "V'doiros haboyim, v'geirim ha'asidim lehizgayim." It talks about those who are not here, is the generations to come, not the ha'asidim lehis, as Rashi says, and also we're talking about geirim that are going to convert in the future. And also this makes sense that in the simple meaning of the verse, that the converts are also part of the covenant. Just as they are included in all Torah mitzvahs, via state in Onei Parsha, as in Ofak Parsha, as it says in the beginning of the Parsha, as it relates to that generation, that also it says clearly v'gercha. So just like that generation, it goes for all generations. Is loitanal nishverstandig. So based on the above, that the explanation that they gave for how could you make a covenant with the future generation. So B'negeya Gedim, if we, as it relates to Gedim, is der tam from Prakara Dabua. So the reasoning that a son is a continuation of the father, would not apply to the Ger, because the Ger's father wasn't there and he's no Hemshech. They are not children for those that were there when this covenant was formed. And says also the other reasoning, if we're looking according to the style, the way we learn according to the simple meaning, the reasoning that their souls were there at the time that the covenant was formed. That also doesn't fit for a ger. Because by a 5-year-old it would make sense to them. As b'shas der ger is sich megayir, that when the convert converts, he gets a new soul, not the soul that was there before. So how did they form the covenant? With the converts that are destined to be Midgayim. So the Gemara brings down Asher Nenu Poi that it means with the Gedim. And the Rebbe says this is also shot that the Gedim were included. So according to the reasoning that they give, how do you form a covenant? Because either it's a continuation from the fathers that were there, doesn't apply to a ger, and also according to the souls, a ger gets a new soul. They weren't there either. So that doesn't answer with regards to, again, we have a problem if this is the way that it connects. On the other hand, li'idoch, on the other hand, so Vibaldas bepashtis is the seichel machayev the krisis brisis given oich with the gerim asidim leiskayim. Okay, we have a question how, but logically, that pashtis we have to say that the covenant was with them. He's favozok Rashi nor doiris hasidim liyis. How come Rashi just says about the generation that are there to come in the future? And he changes from the Gemara to Mashmit Zayin Gedim. How come Rashi does not bring down Gedim? It's a greater novelty. The two reasons I've mentioned before, a broke out of the Abu and the Neshamas were there, doesn't apply to Gedim. So why would Rashi not bring down the second part of the Gemara, the Lashon of Gedim? Well, the Pirush this interpretation that it means the generation that are destined to come is done Tanchuma. Over there, the Tanchuma is the same language. Over there it says, like Rashi says, the generation that are future to come. Over in Gemara, Babli Yerushalmi, but in the Gemara, both in the Babli and the Yerushalmi, stayed b'shinu loshon. Over there it says differently. Over there it says doiros haboyim, not asidim loved doiros haboyim. So the Rebbe is gonna argue that it would seem that the loshon of the Gemara doiros haboyim would be a more appropriate language to use over here. So we need to understand this. Agam as Rashi's pirush is mukhrach from shutev shem mikra, nit from Amar Chazal. So although Rashi's commentary is not because the Gemara said so, it's evidence from the shutev shem mikra. So really, Rashi doesn't have to bring down the language of the Gemara because that's not what forces him. He comes it out because that's the meaning. But the Bald over there zogt himself in Teuchim state in the Rosh Razal, but it still says the same idea, which it says in the expounding of our sages, a blessed memory. But l'cheirem mer masim given, it would have been more fitting, as is also banutzim mit kurzen loschen, that he should use that shorter language haboyim, which state in Shas Babli and Yerushalmi, the word that says in Babli Yerushalmi, this language is shorter. Nit mit loschen. Doiris HaSidim, not with the language of the Tanchuma for Tanchuma, Doiris HaSidim liyis. Obefrat, especially as Aboyim is Haloshim versus Medrokel via Sidim liyis. The language of Aboyim is a more common language than those who are destined to come. Unapia Yedu a good ladik from Loshim Pirush Rashi to the as far based on what is known, how Rashi's language is precise. Rashi's commentary, Bizas is doing the minyan mufloim to the extent that it's so precise that you can find some wondrous things in the language of Rashi. Is Sicha that those was Rashi shtaib doiros hasidim. So for sure, this Rashi writes the generation of the future need doiros haboyim, not that are coming. L'shena Shas is as bekavona. It's specifically ubola lamed, and it's come to teach. Rebbe will later on explain exactly this lashon brings out Rashi's intent here by writing it this way. And number 7, Zayin, the Chidush shebepirush Rashi is doch blois in the Abteich with the Werter and the Pro. Rashi's novelty over here is only in the translation of what does it mean in Enopoi. There is Hasidim Liyas. Tofavos is Rashi Maisik from Posik. So how come Rashi quotes from the verse also the previous words ve'es asher einenu. Rashi should have not said those words ve'esher einenu. He should just said einenu. Not only does he quote the words ve'es asher, nor fatayt zeich beperushay. But even he translated, Ba'afim, he starts off. Because l'cheret the meat is a garnish machadish of posik, seemingly that he does not come up with anything new on the posik by adding the ve'es asher ba'afim. Is Dalit. So the Rebbe is going to explain now that actually we don't need to explain how you can make a generation with the later generations a covenant, because this is a covenant with Hashem. Notwithstanding that it says Anochi Kodesh, that Moshe Rabbeinu was the one that facilitated that Krisis Bris. But the Krisis Bris was done with Hashem, and Hashem can make a Krisis Bris with those who are here and those who are not here. That's self-understood. But Rashi is trying to really machadish here that the Krisis Bris with the coming generations is equal and is at the same level that those that were there at the time. Let's look inside. Dalet. Those Gimel. The Bir v'kolzeh. So what's the explanation of the above? Rashi dafnid bavoranen. Rashi does not need to caution us how we can make a covenant with the doiris hasidim liyes with the generations that are destined to be. But this is moving ma'atzmei. This is self-understood. The Krisis Bris had gemacht der Eibishter. The Eibishter made the covenant, as the pasuk states, Asher Hashem Elokecha kodesh simcha hayom, that which God your God is forming with you today, that covenant. Well, jeder versteht, and everybody understands, as mit dem Eibishter, as der Eibishter can kodesh bris sein, that Hashem can form a covenant, euch mit the doiris as well, nachkommen, also with the generation that will follow. Are you going to say, well, the covenant was done with Moshe Rabbeinu because it says in the pasuk Anochi Kodesh? The Rebbe says no. That would mean he facilitated. And those was the lotion in the Hebrew from Moshe, and this that in Moshe's language it states Anochi Kodesh. Somebody says, I am forming this covenant. Is not der pshat? That doesn't mean as the Krisis Bris is given zwischen Eden with Moshe, that this was a covenant between Eden and Moshe. The Krisis Bris is given zwischen the Eibishter with Eden. Really, what the form of the covenant was between Hashem and the Jewish people. Moshe was part of the Jewish people. He's not the one that is. You're not making a covenant with Moshe. You're making a covenant with Hashem, and Hashem is making a covenant with all the people, including Moshe. Those was Moshe Rabbeinu zogt on Noichi Kodesh Gomer. What does he say? I am forming the covenant. Meintes as Moshe had gemacht the achones. Some Krisis Bris. That means that he prepared for this form of the covenant. And the Yeshleimar, it says we can say that usually the Krisis Bris consists of actually passing through, doing a physical act. So saying the Krisis Bris Bechlal is verbunden mit Hapula, just like forming a covenant in general is connected with an act. That to form a covenant, you make a partition on two sides and you pass through in between. So over here, there was also an act. That's what Moshe Rabbeinu said. I am doing the covenant because the act was done by Moshe. This is so obvious that Hashem can make a covenant with the other generations. As Rashi dafa fil nit bavornen, as is nitkin stiller. Rashi doesn't even have to caution that it's not a contradiction. It's freer state that Hashem lekecha kodesh simcha gomer und noch steht Anochi Kodesh Gomer. We're talking about still in this bracket that the Rebbe was discussing, that Rashi is so obvious that this is a covenant between Hashem and the Yidden. He doesn't even have to answer, well, over here it says, Anochi Kodesh, Hashem lekecha kodesh. But this is obvious that Rashi doesn't have to say anything, that this is a covenant with Hashem. And then, because the covenant with Hashem, Hashem can make a covenant for the future generation. And this is also the simple reason why Rashi needs not explain. That Eibishter gesagt Moshe and the mitzvahs Rashi doesn't explain that. The Rebbe wrote out before. How did Hashem tell the mitzvahs of Allah Doiris for all generations? How could the covenant between the pieces with Avraham Avinu took place? Avraham Avinu is chalev the Doiris, that it also applies. It rests on the later generation. Because by the 5-year-old who's learning Chumash, he understands it very simply. As the Rebbe Hot of Hashem has no limitation on him, God forbid. And he is able to instruct also for the following generations. And therefore, in the simple meaning of the verse, it's not a question to begin with, as mentioned earlier. So what is Rashi's problem? Rashi's problem is, to what degree did it take place with the future generation? Is it at the same level that that generation, just like somebody is here present? The same thing is with the future generation, although they're not present, but it takes place just like with those that are present. And this is what Rashi wants to emphasize. Dalet. Those was Rashi darfun kum and this that Rashi needs to and is coming to explain. Mitvafim deirus hasidim is also the generation that are destined to be. Is need that at some ha'inyan. It's not just the idea as der krisis bris is given. Not that this idea that the forming of the covenant was also with the generations that came later, nor der oifen wie der krisis bris is given, but the way how this covenant forming was with the deirus hasidim from the future, the generation that are destined to be. From them loshen v'loy itchem levadchem anochi keres abris azois. Not just with you am I forming this covenant, that's all azois and this oath ki, but es asher yeshna poi v'es asher enen poi, those who are here and those who are not here, is verstandig. It's understood as a krisis bris that this forming of the covenant kommt nit nor zu mechayev zayin di deirus habayim. It's not just coming to obligate the following generation, the generation that come, nor as the krisis bris, but it's that this form of covenant is gemacht direct. It was a direct form of a covenant mit asher einenu poi, with those who are not here, in demselben Eufen, in the same way, punkt, just exactly like mit asher yeshna poi, with those that are there. Nochmer is muchrach. Even more, this is forced. We have to say that it's at the same level. After the pasuk says to pass you through in the covenant of God your God, about those that are there. So after the Torah says that, so the Torah mentions those that were there again. So we say again, those that are here, that is extra because they were just passed through. Now, this is bichdei, but this is in order. Why do we say again to include with emphasis that that the one who is not here together with the one who is here. Und damit masbir sein, and with that to explain, as the krisis bris by beide sugim is given if that the forming of the covenant by both of these categories was on the exact same way. So the Rebbe is Rashi meitig euch die Wörter ve'eis Hashem. Einenu poi. He also bring up eis Hashem, the words. Is mefarish va'afim also with Doiris Hasidim Liyas. So what does Rashi mean? The most with them is a matish. Number one, as the krisis bris is given direct with the Doiris Hasidim Liyas, that forming of the covenant was directly with the generation that are destined to be. And also number two, that this was exactly similar. Was the lashon af is mechaber umashvit. Lashon af in there is connects and equates. So just like those that were there, equates them to the ones how is not there. So now the Rebbe says, so it turns out, actually, that not only, the Rebbe is going to say, no, say, not only do we not need those interpretations, that there's a hemshech of Brokar Dabua or the Neshamis, because then that would be a unequal comparison. The Yidden there were one way. Rashi's point is, as the Rebbe explains it, is to tell they're the exact same category. So those are not because Brokar Dabua. It is directly with Hashem, equal to those that are there. Hey, is based on this, it turns out, as need nor darf Rashi nit meises. Not only does Rashi not need to add, as the neshamas of the data sabayim zayin don't given that the souls of the coming generation were there, or that as Brokar Dabur, or the other interpretation that the son is the continuation of the father, or dir perushim zayin and mushla. These interpretations are rejected according to the similar Pshut Shomikra. When Mezolenen, as the Christus Bris, if we would learn that the forming of the covenant with those that are not here is Mitzad Brokar Davua, is because a son is a foot of the father, because he is a continuation of the father, Kum Damut Oi. So then it turns out, as the Christus Bris is given in Tzvei Fanim Shonim, that this forming of the covenant was two different ways. The bris mit yeshnepoi, the covenant with those that were here, is given mitim gufa. That was with them themselves. And under bris mit enanupoi, and the one who's not is not given mitim alay. Wasn't with him alone, nor as karadabua, only as a foot of the father as a continuation. Al derech zevet erzan achiluk ayim lernen. That the same thing would be a difference between the two if we should learn as miteinanu pois the Christus given, Bris given, that those are not here. The Christus given nor mitzeir in the Shabbos, only with their souls. The Chazani given by Christus Bris that were at the covenant. Be a difference then between the Yesh Nepoi. By Yesh Nepoi, Yot Mekeris Bris given within the Shabbos. With the Gufim, we make the covenant, the bodies and the souls. By Anen Poi. Over there you only form the neshama, so there's a difference. That's just the opposite Rashi is trying to tell us. Oh, baby, Rashi learns. Rashi learns. As a Pashas Aksuvin is mucha, that from the simple meaning of the verses is mucha. Is va'af im deiros hasidim liyos, and also with the generation of future to be. Haste is doch, so that means that the Christus Bris is given with the Deiros Halein. That was with the general himself, not as Karedabo, not as a following of their father. And in the same style, the same way, as with those that were there. The says mit neshamas ugufim. That is neshamas and bodies. Obefrat. Especially as based upon Rashi explains earlier, that that the people that would form covenants, the way they would do it, they would make a partition on one side, a partition on the other side, and they would go through in between. As the posting by the Brisbane Absorim by Abraham, it says, the Shnayim by Yavrobim sort of they cut the calf in two and they went in between the pieces. Because those beweist doch, that shows as the Alava in every time that all those that pass through, they become one thing. To say nit nor men werd ein Zach mit dem was man macht the bris. It's not only that you're becoming one with the one that you formed the covenant, which in this case would be with the Meiberstun. But this also means as the Alva seine Nichlal in Bris, it means that all those that are included in the covenant are really one. Everybody who goes through that covenant. Vav. So Apihanal is a move on based on the above. It's also understood. Why Rashi doesn't need to mention also Gedim Hasidim Leizgayer, the converts who are destined to convert. While Lefi Pirush Rashi, as the Christus Bris with Enenu Boy, Enenu Poi is Gvemet Zegufa. Because according to Rashi's Pirush, that Enenu Poi is with the people, is Gvemet Zegufa was with they themselves. Then the Torah Hasidim Liyas Nichlo Gedim. So therefore, also in the future generation, that includes the Gedim. One is the Poshut as the Torah Hasidim Liyas. When we talk about the generations that are theirs to come, not talking about anybody specific, includes Gedim as well. Meint Alid for either they're old Jews or every generation for the Shpatadikateris. From the later generations, which would include Gedim. So Rashi doesn't need to tell the Gedim because this is all of them. If we explain Pirush as the Christus Bris is mitzad brokar dabua, according to the interpretation that the Christus Bris is because the son is the foot of the father, but those can need gizog ver mishayach to Gedim. That is not able to be said with relates to Gedim, or the mitzad of the Christus Bris is given in Neshamis, or because of the other reason that it was with the souls. But that also doesn't fit based, as the Rebbe explained before. Shuta Shemikra Bagedim, you can't say because the new soul can now see base Kushidalat. As earlier in Siv Beis, the fourth question. So therefore, over there we have a problem. So if we don't learn like Rashi learns, so the Gemara has to explain how come Gedim is different. But on the contrary, not only does this not a need to mention Gedim, we don't want to mention Gedim because that would mean there's a difference. Rashi can need the Mon and Gedim, and Rashi cannot mention Gedim when they're mitzvah oistel, and that's why they will distinguish them also a category by themselves. When das is anders from them, asher yeshnei, then that would be different. Rashi is trying to say they're the same. This would be different. Asher yeshnei. As mit alle Yidden is given the selber bris, that the same covenant was with all Yidden. Ubemeilas alle seinen ein Sache, they're all one. Notwithstanding, the pasuk does mention Gercha. So previously, when we're talking about what they formed, but it was all these categories. But now, by the Christus bris, they're all included. Nagam has fitted in pasuk. Although that earlier in the verse he does separate the converts as a category by themselves. Is thus their far. The reason for that was dort is mefaret alles so over there he details all categories of Yidden. Shechem given. Dort redt sich nicht wegen dem Bris Gufa. Over there we're not talking about the covenant itself, nor wegen Nitzavim. We're talking about Nitzavim as a preparation for going through the covenant. The pasuk read wegen the Bris Gufa. But when we're talking about the covenant itself, I'm forming the covenant is the Chaycher I detail in the Bazundar Sugim. Then it does not really fit to separate them in separate categories. They all become one. All those that go through as one, including the Ger. And now the Rebbe is going to explain why Rashi chooses Loshna Sidim Liyes instead of Haboyim. The Rebbe will explain that Haboyim still has a flow of a connection to the past, but here we want to say they're going to be in the future and still they're at the same level. Zayin, based on the above, all the above, will also understand was Rashi's medayik, that Rashi is specifically uses Hasidim Liyos, the destined to come on it Haboyim, not Haboyim. The Taich from word Haboyim, the meaning of Haboyim is nit madgish. That doesn't emphasize as die Sachen haben nicht kein Schum Scheiches Kesher mit der Metzies Beuve, that the items have no connection and tie with the present existent, what's here. Haboim to come does not preclude the idea of what is now. Haboim meant, when you say Haboim meant, as die Velun Kumen noch, that these will come following Behemshech, as a flow, B'shayches to them, and as connected to them to the present generation. We have a generation, and then there's a generation that follows. So therefore, when you say the generation that follow, as the meat is although what we are trying to say here, as each side is noch nicht gekommen, that now they're not here yet, they're coming, is the gleichzeitig, but at the same time, we were still talking about a connection when you say they are coming to the previous generation. They will come as a follow, and as a result, they will be born from the generation that's already here. Thus haste, that means to say, basically, is that this generation is machriach der dor, it forces out the generation that comes after it. And therefore, it turns out as mitzad dem dor, that even from the perspective of this generation, there is already the following generation because it's going to follow. Mernit, the only thing is, in the time of this generation, in actuality, it's not yet, it's going to come. Harambam, similar to what the Rambam says. Why did they call him the world to come? It doesn't mean it's not here now. Elam habo is here now, but it's found and it's standing. We already have the Elam habo. Shenamar chulu. But loy karo Elam habo. The only reason why it's called the world to come, because the people that are alive, the Elam habo comes to the person after he lives in this world. In which we exist with our body and soul. Which means Elam habo is here it's standing right now. When I've girufen Elam habo, why are we calling the world to come? Nor the farmers only because it's coming as a result of the life of this world, neshama beguf. You have a neshama beguf, and that comes Elam habo after the life of neshama beguf. That is one of the lotion of haboyim. Like Kegon, the lotion asidim liyos, future to come, is it's legamri nitfarad. That means that now it doesn't exist at all. Nit nor nitobe poil. Not only it's not literally in actuality, but the etzem mitzi is daf erst vern. But that existence still needs to be. It's not around. It's haste. As kommt nit als to the it doesn't come as a result, as a tulda, a birth from Friedrich and Der. It doesn't come. It's something that's going to happen later on. That's why Rashi is very specific. Not the future generation. And then you can think, as the Christus bris mit asherenenu poi, that the forming of the covenant with those that are not here is mitzad dem was design and doiris haboyim. It's because they are generations that come. So there's some connection with this generation. They come as a result and as a follow-up from today's generation. Similar to the explanation that it's because the son is a foot of the father, is a continuation. So you might think that that is the connection to the later generation. And another point, Damult is not butter, then it's not clear. Or the Nochmer, actually is men shoylel digedim. Then maybe you would be rejecting the digedim, was they seinen nit nichlal in Nachkub the Kederis. Then you would say, if we would say Haboyim, then it doesn't include the digedim because they're not following. They don't follow the previous generation. They just going to start this, so maybe we won't be including them. They are not a continuation. They're not a result. They're not the tuldas, the children from the present generation. So that would, if it said aboyim, it may not include. You may think that it rejects the gator, and it also wouldn't be clear what we're trying to say here. Maybe we're trying to say that it's like brokar dabua, that it's just because they're following. But that's exactly Rashi's point, is that no, it's not because of their connection to the previous generation. The riber is Rashi Madgish. Hasidim Liyas, those who are destined to be. But in them is Mudgesh, over here it's emphasized. That their existence is something which comes about in the future. The Mele is moving, and therefore it's understood the Krisis Brisis Gemus sign with Deutes Hasidim Gufa, that this forming of the covenant needed to be with the generation that's coming themselves. And not because they're coming as a follow, a flow, and as a result from this generation. As in them, it's also very clear now that this includes Gerim, who are going to be in the future. They too will be in the future, and they're all included. So this explains very well why Rashi uses Lashon Hasidim Li is not Haboyim, which really shows that it's like something totally new, and yet Abraham afforded the covenant with those who are here, and they're totally new in the same way. Ches. Then Pirush Rashi from this Rashi commentary, it turns out a very great, important lesson in an inyan was not great come in a matter that we'd spoken at the time. It can't treffen. It might happen as a itzel. Amol Zainer of gefallen bazich, that a Jew will be a little down. In felt starkheit, he lacks the strength in Eisvenas and Aveda B'Torah mitzvahs to fulfill, accomplish his service in Torah and mitzvahs. Befarat by Maroizgin in Welt, especially when you go out to the world of in order to spread Judaism. Because we are the minority of all the nations. Is that enter them? So what's the response to that lack and the feeling of down? Thus is that when you talk about the minority, that's when we talk about quantity. Because kamos is mugbal and mudud in zman umoked. Quantity is limited and measured in time and space. And from that perspective, Yidden are in a time and a specific place, and then they're the minority of all the nations. Since, however, the main by a Yid is the quality, the spirituality, which is Torah mitzvahs, is when a Yid connects himself with Hashem through Torah mitzvahs, which is higher than time and space, is so then you are connected truthfully and in actuality with all Jews in the entire world and in all generations. And this is Mudgesh in Pirush Rashi. This is emphasized in Rashi's commentary. Also with the future generation. Just the generation who is standing today. By the forming of the covenant of Hashem with Eden, Zayin and Eden. So they were there. So also Yidden Shebachol Hadeiros in all generations. Gishtanen Damos alle zusammen. Everybody was standing there together. Alle Zayin and Ein Mitzias, they're all one existence. For them is verstandig. So this is understood as B'shasa Yid is verbunden begolim mit Neighbors to Bebris. When a Yid is connected openly with Hashem through the covenant, by observance of the Torah mitzvah actuality. Stay in with them. Alle Eden Shebedorahu. So all Yidden of that generation stand with him. And from alle Doras, from all generations, alle zusammen, they make up one whole story. Damot, that it came out, then we're not a minority. Also not quantity wise. Adrabah, on the contrary, Eden Zainarim Otzum, Eden are a powerful majority. Oich, or many, Oich Bekamas, also quantity wise. And they don't need to be scared. I feel it even not from the quantity for a mispar gadol bekamus goyim, from a large number quantity of goyim on adrab, and on the contrary, tipel aleihem upon them will fall the fear and dread. B'shas says atum nitzavim ayim kulchem, when we're all standing together lachodim kechad. As Eden stehen alle zusammen begolu, that Eden stand all together openly, stay united. Is damot atem mitzvah kayomim be'emdim. So then you're standing and strong. That means that you merit in the judgment. Das bringt ksivach simatova, Rosh Hashanah. This brings the written and being sealed for the good. To kol achad v'achas b'Yisrael, to each and every one, men and women of the Jewish people, in good that is visible and revealed. This is Mesichas Shabbos Parshas Nitzavim Vayelech Tov Shin Lamed Hey.